Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. I'm Khong Foong, Professor of Political Science and Co-Director of the Center for Asia and Globalisation at the Lee Kuan Yew School. On behalf of the school, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's esteemed distinguished lecture by Professor Ayşe Zarakol of the University of Cambridge. Before I introduce Professor Zarakol, I would like to say a few words about this lecture series. The esteemed distinguished lecture is made possible by a generous donation from the late businessman and philanthropist Mr. Lee Sing T, director of the Lee Group of Companies. It is a prestigious program that brings prominent scholars and policymakers to Singapore to address critical international issues and is aimed to enliven public discourse on those matters. Past speakers, for those of you who have been here, include Indian Foreign Minister Subramaniam Jayashankar, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State, the late Richard Armitage, Francis Fukuyama of Stanford University, the Governor of Jakarta, Mr. Anies Baswedan, and Professor Ian Johnston of Harvard University. So on behalf of the school, I wish to earnestly thank Dr. Lee and the Lee Foundation for making this series of lectures possible through their generosity. And now let me come to Professor Ayşe Zarakol, who is a Professor of International Relations at the University of Cambridge, where she is also a Politics Fellow at Emmanuel College. Professor Zarakol's research focuses on East-West relations and social hierarchies in world politics, problems of modernity and sovereignty, rising and declining powers, and the history and future of international order. She is the author of After Defeat, How the East Learned to Live with the West, published by Cambridge University Press in 2011, and Before the West, The Rise and Fall of Eastern World Orders, published by the same press in 2022, as well as the editor of Hierarchies of World Politics. Her book, Before the West, has won 6 awards, including the International Studies Association Annual Best Book Prize. And in 2023, Prof. Zarakol was awarded the 8th Rathmi Khong Medal of Science in Turkey, and the first one they awarded for international relations. In 2024, she was elected to a fellowship in the British Academy and the Academia Europa. Her new research is just as fascinating. She's overseeing an international research collaboration on global disorder, which is partly the topic today, which is funded by British Academy Knowledge Frontiers Grant. So without further ado, let me hand over the podium to Professor Zarakol to present the 2025 St. Lee Lecture, Distinguished Lecture on Is the Disorder of Our Times Unprecedented? From the Lessons of History.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Professor Khong, and thank you for inviting me here to Singapore. It's been a wonderful week, and it's very nice to interact with everybody here. So this talk is The Disorder of Our Times Unprecedented, comes out of this Knowledge Frontiers grant that I've been overseeing for the last 2 years, and we've received an extension recently. It's an evolving talk. I've given it in a number of settings. I think I'm very close to finalizing it as an article, so I'm also very interested to hear what you make of it, your feedback, and I look forward to the questions which will come after the talk. So if we think about the times we're in, I think there is a general consensus that they are particularly tumultuous. The view is a bit different from Asia, but especially in the West, there is I think a near consensus that we are living through times of global disorder. Our century opened with 9/11 attacks, quickly followed by the war on terror, U.S. interventions in Afghanistan, in Iraq, We had the global financial crisis, which again was more of a Western crisis, but with global impact. We had the so-called Arab Spring, turmoil in the Middle East, regime change. We've had numerous protest movements. Occupy Wall Street is one example, but they've been all around the world. We've had, the Syrian civil war, intervention in Libya. We had Euromaidan, Ukraine, the infamous taper tantrum in 2013, which changed, investment patterns, with Fed signaling, and Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. I mean, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just, some highlights just to jog your memories. Many of us have lived through these. The European refugee crisis, Brexit, Trump's first term, COVID, again, global impact, Hong Kong, Russian invasion of Ukraine, October 7th and its aftermath. And of course, Trump is back and just in 1 year, not even a year, he's completely upended international institutions, trade regimes, the developmental space. So there's a lot of turbulence in the system. There is increasing, according to many observers, also financial volatility. Partly having to do with the stage of capitalism we're in. Partly having to do with growing patterns of economic inequality around the world, wealth concentrating in the hands of very few individuals and companies, and that also adds unpredictability to international politics. And of course, in the background of all of this, there are fears about climate change, and there is this sense, at least scientists tell us, that this is only going to get worse. It's going to disrupt trade. It's going to disrupt supply chains. It's going to create more refugee inflows. And we just, again, it adds to our sense of uncertainty, disorder, things coming apart, and the world not being what it used to be. So in this project, in the Global Disorder Project, we're trying to make sense of, what's going on. How do we think about this? How do we define disorder? Are these subjective feelings of disorder, or is there something measurable material going on? And also, I'm happy to talk about those aspects of the project in the Q&A. But where we started is from the way people think about the current period of disorder. And if you survey the way people talk about what's going on, especially in the West, you find two kinds of takes that dominate the conversation. One is that we're living through unprecedented times. It's particularly bad. Whatever is happening, there's never been a period like this, and I'll explain that a little bit more. Or we find a lot of references to the 20th century, that this is somehow a repeat of the 20th century. If I can give just a little bit more detail on both of those takes, the unprecedented argument, disorder of our times unprecedented argument, is often expressed with this term polycrisis, which is something the economic historian Adam Tooze popularized in places like Financial Times. And the argument goes something like, there are political problems, but we also have unprecedented challenges in climate, technological change, again, financial crises, and altogether they're combining to amplify each other. It's a time of polycrisis. So we cannot really look to history to learn from history because, we've never had all of these challenges together. So that's one side of the camp. And then there's a second camp. You'll find us more in the IR space, international relations space, that this is just like the 20th century. What we're living through, it's not that, different from what happened maybe in the interwar years in the 20th century. It's a time of power transition, time of rebalancing, China's rise, U.S.'s relative decline, and eventually things will settle down. Once we get the balance of power right, once we find some kind of equilibrium, we're going to be in the second Cold War, in the next Cold War. As you can see, there are many books about the new Cold War. I did a very quick search. I'm sure there are more. And it's an attractive argument, right? That we are going through turbulent times, but we're heading into something familiar, something we know about, something we've studied, especially in international relations. What I'm going to suggest to you today in this talk is that maybe they are both wrong. Maybe we can split the difference, that they both get some things right and some things wrong. So I do agree with, of course, colleagues in international relations who make the argument that great power competition is back, and this has all sorts of knock-on effects. That much, seems obvious, evidence, and that's all true. But I think there are 4 ways the world is different from the 20th century. So this easy comparison between interwar years and our current disorder and the Cold War and where we're headed doesn't necessarily work. And those 4 ways are the following. One is this global trend we can observe that again maybe felt less here, but there's been a general rejection of 20th century institutions, ideologies, arrangements, the political solutions we had kind of agreed upon in the 20th century. Now, I've used this photo to illustrate this phenomena because this is, a toppling of statues after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But I think that's what we used to call the Second World is where that trend started. But I think it's a global trend. Now we're seeing, the rejection of liberalism or even liberal democracy in the West. So the 20th century, we're not at the end of history. Where we are at the moment of, these ideologies, institutions we thought were going to stay here forever are being rejected by populations around the world. The nation state is still standing, so that has durability. But the arrangements on top of the nation state that seemed settled have been rejected. And when you survey populations around the world, the trust in, especially government institutions are very low. Maybe Singapore is an exception. The other global trend that we see, which again people compare to the 20th century, but I think something else is going on in the 21st century. And what I mean here is this global trend of strongman politics. Of course, we had strongmen in the 20th century. We had autocracies in the 20th century, but our current crop of strongmen are taking in a different direction this type of regime. And what I think is going on here is what I would call the reprivatization of the state. Modernity is a story of getting away from state as a private realm of the monarch, of the sovereign. It's a story of depersonalization of state institutions, of rational bureaucracies. If you've studied state formation, these are trends that you would study. Certainly, there's that story in Europe, but it has its corollaries elsewhere too. And in some places around the world, it never reached culmination. But again, for much of modernity, we moved away from privatized states. Now, in the 21st century, that trend seems to have reversed. We don't just have autocrats. We have leaders who are ruling countries as if they were their personal domain, and it's about them, their person, sometimes their family. And compared to, I would say, their 20th century counterparts, they are much less constrained because they don't seem to subscribe to any ideology except the ideology of me. It's about me. And I think that's a difference between the 21st century and the 20th century. And it's bringing back a kind of an older form of politics that we had moved away from, which also then makes international relations less predictable because foreign policy, it's no longer, about ministers of foreign affairs or long-term planning. It's more about, Trump's decision, who gets along with Trump, more about personal calculations. The third way I think the 21st century is different from the 20th, and therefore cannot just be explained by great power competition, is what is called somewhat problematically, because the label is reductive, but what's called the rise of the global south. And we all know, the global south doesn't capture. I mean, here's a map that's, again, we can debate who's in the global south, who's not. What I'm more interested in is the fact, whatever we call it, and we know Asia is different from Africa and, from South America and all that, but still, it's an undeniable reality that there are many more, not only just more countries, but more countries with agency, more actors, with both the resources and the confidence to take an interest in international politics, and they're in the mix, they're in the game, and that in some ways is a positive development. But also, if you're looking at it from a uncertainty perspective, from a disorder perspective, more players means less predictability, right? I mean, our formal modeler colleagues will tell you it's much harder to model these types of interactions when you have more actors. So that's the third way that the 21st century is different. And the fourth way, and this is, I think, where the polycrisis camp is right, is there are all these radical structural changes, or a lot of structural pressures, let's say, come down to bear on politics. So I've tried to capture with this illustration, but what I mean by structural changes are things a bit beyond our control, a bit beyond our agency. So climate, to some extent, finance in some ways, it can, especially in times of crisis, that's something that escapes our control. Also technology. And of course, these things were not absent from 20th century politics, but they were more steady, more stable, more in the background. You could bracket it off more. Now we are having what these changes have sped up. So we're all, wherever I go, everybody's asking, what are you guys doing about AI? And I don't think that would be a topic of conversation even 5 years ago, and now we know it's really fundamentally changing our lives, educational institutions. It's going to reconfigure society, or it's a giant bubble and it's going to cause a massive financial crisis, and that again is going to be, so there are all these factors that are creating volatility and unpredictability in the order. So I think the 21st century is not like the 20th in these ways. Then the question is, are the polycrisis people right that these are completely unprecedented, nothing to learn from history? And there I part ways with them, because I think we can always learn from history if we know how to set up the comparison. So I'm going to propose another period that I think maybe is more productive to analogize from, to learn from. And that argument comes out of my last book, Before the West. And I'm just going to briefly summarize the book in order to make the point that I'm going to make. In Before the West, I try to show that international orders do not start in Westphalia, which is the traditional account. They do not start with Europeans in the 17th century. Instead, we can go back in time. And I went back to, 13th century Asia. You could go back even further. But 13th century is an interesting moment of order making, because you have, the Mongol Empire essentially conquering much of this continent that we call Asia. So it's a moment of, convergence for people in this part of the world, for most of them, and kind of like the Roman Empire for Europe. And the argument of the book is that from 13th century to the 17th century, there were orders that were centered in Asia, that were organized according to political principles that came out of this experience. A particular understanding of sovereignty was quite dominant. It wasn't everywhere, but it ordered politics, and it made the East. So the book starts with the world empire of Genghis Khan, that I argue made the East. And, it was an ordering moment where the world became quite connected in particular ways. How do we know this? Because, there are travelers like Ibn Battuta who are able to make their way in this order, just as many of us are, have mobility in the current international order. That's how, things are connected, and there's been convergence around certain understandings, or food items that spread. The dumpling is a good example, but of course, along with that, many other things, practices that were in East Asia went to West Asia and vice versa. So that order was followed by what we might call a bipolar order of the early Ming and the Timurids in the late 14th, early 15th century. I'm not going to get into it. If I know there may be objections to this characterization, but happy to answer this in the Q&A. And then a third international order, or a world order as I call it, because this is a time before nation states. In the 16th century, we have a globalizing world, and that globalizing world has in its center three West Asian empires: the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. And they are dominating both trade and politics and influencing, and you can see the influences of the same political principles in Europe via the Habsburgs in Moscow. China, the Ming have moved away from it, but still, also you can see some of these ideas trickle to this part of the world, right? through trade as well. So that's the 16th century. For the point I'm trying to make in this talk, the way the argument in the book relates is that the 16th century, in comparison to the 17th century, is a much more connected century with a lot of shared political ideas, a lot of trade. Now, when we study the 16th century, the traditional way of looking at it is looking at European trade routes, because this was a time that Europe was also coming on the scene, and they, had, started like the earlier forms of European colonialism. Certainly, they were in Americas and here. But what that often omits is the fact that, because we only look at it from the European perspective, and we forget that the European maritime routes were add-ons, the additions to an already very, very connected kind of world. So that's, a simplified illustration of 16th century trade routes. So we have in the 16th century not a totally global order, but nearly globalizing order, connected, prosperous. In general, there's a population increase, and that is followed in the 17th century with nearly a century. Well, it starts in late 16th century and lasts about to the last quarter of the 17th century. A century of disorder. So I became aware of this in writing this book. And that's partly where the disorder project came from, because the book was focused on orders, recovering orders. But now I'm interested in this comparison between the 17th century and the 21st century. This is a period that's well known in European historiography, sometimes called the general crisis of the 17th century. It's been well studied by European historians from, and historical sociologists, Hobsbawm, Trevor Roper, others have written about it. Because, of course, if you know European history, you know that this is the period of 30 Years' War before Westphalia. It's the period of the English Civil War. A lot of rebellions in Europe. I mean, 30 Years' War is initially the Dutch rebellion. You have the Fronde in, France. But actually, it was... These problems were not limited to Europe. If you look at especially the Northern Hemisphere, many settings had their own rebellions. So the Ottomans faced almost a century of rebellion. Of course, in China, the main, they faced similar, and the Ottomans were able to hold on. The Ming weren't. You have the time of troubles in Muscovy, later Russia. So it's a very long period of disorder, and also we don't have enough data about what was happening in the southern hemisphere, but certainly we know that there were wars, rebellions in much of the established units. Now, there are different explanations as to what's going on. One is, it could be completely random that everybody was facing problems at the same time. But some of the existing explanations actually highlight features of this period that are quite reminiscent of our own. So this is a period of financial crisis. So for a long time, the explanation as to what was happening in Europe was the Spanish price revolution, the influx of cheap silver from Americas, upsetting the existing economic arrangements. So that's been in the historiography. This is also a period that we associate with people turning away from old institutions, especially the church in the European setting. It's also known in the historiography as the age of absolutism, again referring to Europe, but arguably it's Europe is at the tail end of a longer wave of absolutist rulers, which is something I discuss in the book. You have more countries with power because, I mean, similar to the rise of the global south, of course, at the time it was Europe that was rising. Europe had been quite provincial backward. In the 16th century, they become actors with ability to influence world politics. And finally, and maybe surprisingly, some historians now attribute what was going on in the 17th century with climate change. I say surprisingly because most of us assume climate change is a relatively recent problem. And in some ways, if we're talking about man-made climate change, specifically linked to the Industrial Revolution, that is true. But there is also climate change in the 17th century. This is the period, the coldest period of a longer cool period known as the Little Ice Age. So the Little Ice Age is supposed to have lasted from around the 13th century to the 19th century. And the 17th century was when, in the Northern Hemisphere, it was particularly acute. That may also have man-made causes having to do with the discovery of Americas. This is debated in the scholarship. But we do know, right, that the climate patterns became quite unpredictable. We know from European paintings that it was a colder period. Paintings from this period. This is a Belgian one from this era. But we do also know that climate had an effect on especially overland trade in Asia. And it probably has something to do with, the crop failures and so on, have something to do with the rebellions that we see all over the place. And this is a period of great demographic decline. So, for instance, in the Ottoman Empire, about a third of the villages went off the tax registry in this period. So 16th century, you have population growth. 17th century, across the board, you have demographic decline. So for these reasons, I think this is a period that makes a nice comparison to our era. And by that, I don't mean the same things will happen or that it's an identical period. But if we're looking for historical analogies to think with, I think maybe it's a better candidate than the 20th century, because it is also a period where there's some of the challenges that we're facing. So what we find in the 17th century is the fragmentation of the 16th century order, which, again, in my opinion, was much bigger and globalized and connected than the Eurocentric literature makes it out to be. We have demographic decline. What we have is a lot of the old powers, old empires turning inwards to deal with their problems of rebellion. So they kind of stop competing with each other. The Ottomans, for instance, leave the Habsburgs alone for a long time, but the Habsburgs were dealing, in a way, with their own rebellion. In a way, the 30 Years' War is their own rebellion. So there is increased regionalization. There's a lot of fragmentation. There's breakdown of trade routes, again, overland trade routes, which had stood the test of time for centuries. And it's a long period of disorder. And that's out of that disorder comes the phenomena we call the rise of the West or rise of Europe. So out of this period of disorder, new winners emerge. Europe is rising prior to the 17th century compared to what they were before, but they're coming from a real place of relative backwardness. And it's not clear that had it not been for the intervention of the 17th century general crisis, that they would go on to, to create the order that they did, European actors. So I think there are some, it's really in the 18th and 19th centuries that European Western order takes off, partly by salvaging and repurposing some of the institutions of the old fragmented order of the 16th century. So what kind of lessons can we draw from this? The first lesson, or the first takeaway for me, is as tempting as it is to look at, the 20th century and assume that things will be familiar. We have to be a little bit more open-minded, I think, as to how world politics can transpire. The 20th century analogy tells us, there may be war, but it will last only a few years. And then order will emerge, and it will be, because what came after the interwar years, right, is the order that we all know. But, if you look at the 17th century, that's a different scenario. It may be that fragmentation lasts a long time. No new order, or at least an order with global ambitions quickly reemerges. So we should also prepare for scenarios that allow for that possibility. That what do we do, for those of us who are alive now? Like, how do we prepare ourselves for a long period of disorder, long period of uncertainty, when there are no convergence of norms or institutions? So that's one lesson. The second lesson that I would take away from the 17th century is part of the reason I think Europe emerged advantageous from this period is they were less nostalgic about what was before. So they spent less time trying to capture what was being lost. But if you look at the Ottoman Empire, or to some extent the Ming, in Asia, there was more of an attempt to recover the 16th century. And even after, these places recovered from the 17th century period of disorder and went on, 18th century is not bad, really, in Asia. But there's a sense of loss, I think, like kind of a residue, a shadow of something that's been lost, which Europe didn't have. Europe was more open to new solutions or innovations, what is called the scientific revolution. I think it's that nostalgia can be quite dangerous in times of global disorder. So I think it suggests to me that in this global disorder period, if it's going to last for a while, outside of the West, there's an advantage because I think it's the West that is particularly attached, or at least certain groups in the West. I mean, I'm also in some ways a product of that, so I'm quite attached to the 20th century order. But those who are able to let go, I think have an advantage in these periods of uncertainty. And also in long periods of disorder or uncertainty, I mean, just generalizing from what I've just said now, what used to be disadvantages become advantages. Some of, again, Europe's advantage, they had come up with mechanisms, for instance, to deal with risk. Maritime movements were more risky. You have, for instance, insurance. So certain mechanisms they had to come up with to cope with their previously disadvantageous situation became advantages in the period of disorder. So, I mean, it's just another way of saying in periods of disorder, one has to be open to looking at things in a different way, in a fresh way. And it's from that period, of course, emerged new political arrangements, that are still with us today. The nation states, again, had it not been for that period, would it have become as hegemonic as it is as a political form? I think we can debate. So we have to be open, I think, in the 21st century, both to the possibility of lasting disorder, but also radical change. And we have to come up with ways of preparing for that. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Zarakol, for a most fascinating lecture, and in which you take us through the centuries and answer your question actually very explicitly, that this is not unprecedented, right? And I really, as you know, I'm also an ardent student of the lessons of history, but I do it in a much more, I guess, minuscule way, right? I look at events and how they are, whereas you deal with centuries. And I thought the way you came to the sharing with us the importance of the 17th century was especially interesting and rigorous, because those who have studied the difficulty of applying the lessons of the past to understanding contemporary situation, their first warning, think of Ernest May and Richard Newstead, is never settle on the first historical precedent that that appears in your mind, for psychological reasons, for not letting go reasons, right? And that's why I thought your beginning, where you say that, look, people think of the current situation in terms of the 20th century or a new Cold War. And there are some elements which are similar, but by and large, that's not a very helpful way to go about it. And you take us through your centuries based on your book, and then come to a very definite conclusion that let's look at the 17th century, and here are some of the similarities that we need to think through. And that, I think, is really, really helpful. So maybe, I have one or two questions that I would like to ask you, but I thought, given that we have only about half an hour left for questions, I'll just let the audience come in first. Now, if you want to ask a question, can I ask that you use the mic, tell us your name and your affiliation, and keep your question short.
Good evening. My name is Catherine. I'm an expat living here in Singapore. My question to you is this. President Donald Trump is arguably one of the key architects of international disorder during our current times. During, or after rather, he completes his term in office, do you foresee a decrease in global disorder, or is there simply no going back? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Professor. I would like to ask,
what's your name?
My name is Lazarus. I'm from the MPP program here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I would like just to ask a little bit on your thoughts on the similarities on the impact that companies or like private entities has on like international relations compared to like the previous centuries that you mentioned, and also because of the rise in big tech, etc. But second of all, also were there a high degree of diffusion of knowledge and information as of today, like back then? Like I just didn't know the landscape of those two things. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Great questions. So, Kat, first question is: can we go back after Trump? I mean, when I make this comparison, I don't mean to speak definitively. So it's more, I want us to think with the 17th century. What happens if it's like that as opposed to the 20th century? So I'm not saying that we're definitely going to have a century of disorder. At the same time, if I had to place odds, I would say there's not really going back after Trump. Part of this is because, Trump himself is part of a bigger trend, a global trend. And what we're seeing, I mean, what I was talking about, strongman privatization of the states, that is a phenomenon we're finding in many, many different settings. It's arising in, even in like Saudi Arabia. Like I think the Saudi Arabia is part of this trend, which sounds like a silly thing to say because it was already a monarchy. But the MBS has made it really about his person, has gotten rid of all the the existing checks and the elders and so on, shut them in the hotel. And, so all types of different regimes are producing Trump-like leaders. So I think, I see Trump as the American manifestation of like this larger trend. So a part of me, and also because he's really weakened institutions and norms in the U.S. in such a way that one could get rid of Trump, but the odds are that the system will produce another Trump-like figure, and it could even come from the left. And I think that trend is at this point gained so much speed, it's almost irreversible. So the question more for me is now, can we save some countries from experiencing the same? Because it's almost the structure is almost selecting for this. It's what's encouraged. It's what's it's becoming the norm, the new norm. So how do we shield places that have not yet experienced it from the same experience? And it's very difficult, once the international kind of starts dictating, this is how things work. And you could say, like, right now, like, I would say China is a bit less, but Russia, US, but to some extent China too. Like, they all have this type of arrangements. So then the message is, like, to other settings, you'd better like come up with your own version, like even if you don't want to, because this is how you will, how you will get things done. Anyway, so I've digressed a little bit from your question, but I think it's an irreversible trend that may possibly be resisted in some settings. That's my personal opinion. This Lazarus's question, private entities, how do they fit into this? It's an excellent question, and I worry that there is a next step in this global strongman trend, which is that right now our strongmen are produced from politics. So they are still, they're less constrained, but they're still somewhat constrained. They're still talking about like the American people. There are echoes of the 20th century in their behavior. What I worry about is the next crop of strongman, the next generation will be like the tech bros. They will be the next strongman, and they really have no, nothing that's to keep them accountable. And that's what I mean. Like, new forms of politics could arise from a long period of disorder. To us, it sounds like silly or like science fiction, but nation states didn't exist. They came to dominate the world. So it is possible that we could have units that are governed by tech bros. I awfully not, but yeah. So often the comparison is the East India Company and so on. But I think the East India Company was a very different kind of thing than this like tech bro. I don't know, tech brodom. I don't even know what to call it. And yeah, so that's not there obviously in the 17th century. And also with the diffusion of knowledge, certainly social media is contributing to our sense of disorder. I could have talked about that. In the 17th century, until we get to the 17th century, part of the way the world is connected is there is actually a lot of circulation of knowledge and books and know-how. But of course, it's a pre-modern world in many ways, so it's much slower, and it's more like people moving rather than our instantaneous way of getting information. So that's another way it's different. But the point I'm trying to make is 16th century is more connected than the 17th century. So you could reach great connectivity and have it all break down, and we should consider that possibility.
I'm Duncan McCargo from NTU Social Sciences. Thanks so much, Ayşe, for this fantastic lecture. It's given me really lots of things to think about. I guess I just want to zoom in on one word, and that's the word lessons, because I like everything else you said, but I'm struggling with this idea of lessons. I remember my former colleague, Joan Scott, giving these lectures at Columbia about lessons of history, very strongly arguing there are no lessons from history. This is a delusion. It's a misunderstanding. It's too didactic. It's too reductive. So how would you defend using the word lessons rather than just saying perspectives from history, insights from history, or some other?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Maybe I should say insights. But the lessons for me, the lesson is not to get locked into one possibility or one scenario, and let's consider this other scenario. So I'm trying to use history to open people's minds, to get them to consider different scenarios, different outcomes. So I think that's why, for me, that is the lesson. So I think that's still in the spirit of what you said, but maybe I should have better word choice. Maybe I should say insights or, messages or something. Thank you for that. Yeah.
What I find really interesting about your conception of lesson, which I think Duncan is so perceptive to raise, is that they are really macro historical lessons, right? It's about the broad sweep of the 17th century and what they can tell you, like avoid nostalgia, right? And it's an advice that is at a very, very high level. Whereas most of the accounts in IR that we have of people learning from history, they are tailored to very specific events. This is like the Cold War, right? And if you argue that our times now is like the Cold War, then you might expect that the two superpowers are going to compete in a sense like the Cold War. They are unlikely to end up in a nuclear war, right? And that they may do proxy wars, and then in the end, the US has a good chance of winning or something of that sort, all right? And along the way, we can question each of the premises. So that is a very specific kind of learning from history. Yours is actually at a much, much higher macro level. Am I right to...
Yes. I don't want to be formulaic about it. I don't think, there's always contingency, in politics and history. So I never feel at ease with, we've studied history and we found X general law. It always works like this. So I'm not comfortable with that. At the same time, I think, macro history does teach us there are patterns. You don't have infinite possibilities. So you can start seeing certain patterns and you can speak somewhat probabilistically. This is what's likely to happen. So I think we can still, I don't want to completely go in the very micro direction where, like, as, that's why I'm not a historian. Historian colleagues would say, we have to study each time period and so on. Although they do often, draw lessons, they would never say that they do. They are very much, attuned to contingency. So I'm kind of in the middle, right? I want to look for patterns, but I don't want to speak, in complete 100% terms. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks. My name's David Austin. I'm writing this up for the school's website, Globalisation. And my question really follows on the last two statements, and especially kind of bring it back to a specific question for Singapore. I'm going to ask the Kiansu question of what can we get out of this. It's generally accepted that Singapore has been benefiting from the past period of order of the 20th century. But now with the warning from you that this period of disorder could last a long time, are there any examples of, say, a small state or a small power in the 17th century that was able to weather the storm and come out okay? That could be a model for Singapore.
So you said that every country have their own solutions in this disorder world. Similar to in the 16th century, you have the nation states as one solution, and also other Habsburg or Austrian Empire have their empire solution. to this disorder. But I was just wondering, for this kind of stuff, solutions, you need a validation process via this competition across states, right? So you have your solutions, but at the end of the day, you need to compete against other states. So in that case, probably nation state will be a convergent solution in 17th century. So I'm not sure whether we can apply this lesson to the coming age.
Hi, my name's Shantanu. I'm an ex-banker. My question to you is that you dealt with the 17th century and people talk about what exactly happened and how there was disorder there. But we also had the 18th century after that, which led to different political phenomenon coming up, which never existed before. French Revolution, the American Revolution, democracy in parts of the West, which were not seen before this. And did they arise out of this thing? And do we think that we're also seeing the parallels of the so-called Gen Z revolutions happening around Asia, etc., which is again driven by social media, etc. Do you see that parallel in some way, and that's a way out of this, in a way that, while we did get colonialism in the 18th century, but we also got the fundamentals and the basics of the new order in some way?
Yeah.
Three questions.
Thank you. 3 questions. I mean, the first 2 I think I can take together. So what's, a small country like Singapore or like a city-state, what can we get from the 17th century? So, I mean, before the 17th century, the world is quite varied when it comes to political forms, right? You have empires and cities and all sorts of different things. I mean, again, like talking especially in parts of the world I know, but in general, I think this is true. After that, like order collapses and then the new one is formed. I mean, you still have empires, but right, we have, again, I'm not going to get into it, but we have the rise of the nation state form, which is like kind of a Western European, arrangement. And then it becomes such a deep norm that everywhere, every kind of political unit has to look like and function like a nation state, even if they're not really, and they weren't really. So that becomes kind of the expectation. There's like a homogenizing effect in terms of, political units. Because, there's a new global order. And then you see that like here, I mean, is Singapore a city-state? Is it a nation-state? It's both. But again, it doesn't fit the original model. It's kind of a variation. So what I was trying to, like the 17th century comparison, I suppose, would tell us that the process could happen in reverse. Like we could have, breakdown, fragmentation, new political arrangements becoming more attractive, appealing. I mean, I've talked about the tech bro, like fiefdoms, but maybe like city-states become more attractive in this new world. Again, like as politics become unstable, people look for new solutions, new arrangements. And it may turn out that like Singapore is actually very well placed to weather this kind of storm. That's the real challenge may be on the, on the, I don't know, maybe the nation state, or like we may find like, the very big countries find it difficult, so it's uncertain times. It creates room for new political experiments. That was the point I was trying to make. What was the third question? Sorry, yes, the new political. Yes, that's. So again, like if we go to the historical comparison, I think the 17th century rebellions are like it's the fragmentation of the old order. And then the end of 18th century, early 19th century rebellions, which we call revolutions, are more about, giving birth to the new. So it's like a very long period that the old order fragments and dies. Presumably, I mean, hopefully it doesn't take us 200 years to give birth to new political arrangements. Things move faster now. We're more connected, as modernity, things have gained speed. So hopefully for us, that period of disorder doesn't last as long. New arrangements are faster in coming. I do think we need to find, especially with having to do, old, as I said, trust in old institutions are breaking down in many parts of the world. Right now, the solution to it in many places seems to be the strongman stuff, which is, again, a very old solution that is coming back. But it's not really a solution. So I think we need to find new political arguments for the people, like why they matter, how they can be part of the political process. Otherwise, we won't be able to stop these tech bros. So I hope those arguments come fast, as they did in the 18th and 19th century.
There was a second question by Jianwei, right?
The second question was, sorry. Yeah, I took notes, but now I can't remember.
Do you want to just summarize it very succinctly?
Yes. No, that's different solutions. Yeah, I tried to answer
okay. All right, great. So you have answered both. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Daniel, and we talk a lot about disorder and international relations here. And I want to go back to the 20th century, actually, and ask about international systems of order, particularly the League of Nations and the United Nations. These organizations have been debatedly successful. So do you think there's a place in our current century of disorder for these sort of organizations?
Thank you. So I have two questions. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Center of International Law here at NUS. So my first question related to the climate change argument that you're making, because there is whole school of literature explaining why the little ice age will lead to political instability, but I worry that the reverse is not necessarily true. So at least when we look at from a grand historical scale, warmer period generally leads to political stability. So can we say that in this sense, the global climate change that we are facing with temperature rising, causing more political instability, is it not already unprecedented from this angle? And my second question relates to, I think you already indicate in your presentation that artificial intelligence might be, something that is indeed unprecedented, right? But when we look at the 17th century, we don't see any such technology that could cause a great divergence. We have Isaac Newton, we have classical mechanics, but they were not technology that were causing the diversion between the East and the West. So maybe is it your argument that the artificial intelligence is not such a game changer, or what is your view on AI? Thank you.
Hi, Prof. Ayşe. Thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I'm Swati. I'm a parent and an individual, and my question relates somewhat to what this gentleman was asking about. We're looking at a very macro view historically, based on documents and data that's available. We didn't have much information on what it was like for individuals during that transition or periods of disorder in the past. But because we're currently living through this, and this is the conversations we're having in real time, and we're living in this modern world where individuals' in views and opinions are documented and we can easily have a voice. How do you think, looking forward as we move through these periods of disorder, what will be the role of individuals versus this macro view of men of power, technocratic setups? Or what do you think the individual's role will be in the new?
Yeah, those are three really good and difficult questions. I will take more so I can think more about them, but no, let me try to tackle these big ones. So international organizations today have a role to play in a century of disorder. Ideally, I'm wrong, and it is like the best case scenario. I'm wrong. We have a period of uncertainty. some conflict, rising conflict, but then things settle down, and then we are able to salvage and like repurpose international organizations, and more or less business as usual. Maybe it's a bit or more oriented to Asia. The West has declined a bit. All of these are really in the realm of possibility. I don't mean to say that it's impossible, that it will certainly be like the 17th century, that we're going to have breakdown and fragmentation. So in that, best case scenario, door A, international organizations continue more or less with like slightly different power holders, with slightly different rules, but they're not fundamentally different, and they play a role in keeping the international together. I worry that if that doesn't come to pass and we do have fragmentation, then some of these international organizations will like live on as like zombie versions of themselves, because you do see this often, at the ends of like orders. Things don't disappear, they just kind of continue existing in name, but they don't really have any function, and it creates kind of the illusion alive that you are actually like things haven't changed. I do worry about that scenario a bit. But if there is fragmentation, I mean, one good news about that, one of the outcomes of the 17th century was, as I said, regionalization. Everybody kind of turning inwards to their own regions, the great powers of the time. So we might see that regional organizations become more important than international organizations. Again, if you're a certain age, you're accustomed to the international, its loss will be felt, but maybe it will work better in other ways, like that regions are more robust and more together. So that's the organizations question. I think both are possible. Yes, I mean, the climate change challenge is an interesting one. I can see yes, yeah. So there is, you're right, there's like some of these debates are a bit ecologically determinist, and there is an association with warm periods with certain kind of politics, cold periods with other kinds of politics, and so I think some of these correlations do exist. So the medieval warm period, for instance, like is associated with the Mongols' expansion, the having grasslands, for horses and so on. But I think for my purposes, what's interesting or what's comparable or something that we can think with is you hold climate constant. You make certain assumptions. Orders built on certain assumptions. Things will work a certain way. Climate doesn't really factor into your assumptions. And then suddenly climate changes in either direction, and your assumptions are no longer true. So like the arrangements that you had don't work, or they don't work as well as they used to. I think that is what's comparable. So that's what I'm trying to say. Like, so the overland trade from East Asia to West Asia was built on certain assumptions about, not just weather, but also about politics, political stability, and so on. And in 17th century, you have the breakdown of that. Again, our whole global order, our shipping, our airline industries, like they are built on assumptions of, the weather being a certain way. If it changes drastically in a relatively short period of time, can we change our arrangements quickly enough to compensate for it? Maybe, but maybe not. And then that would create the same kind of strains, I think, on the existing order. That doesn't mean like a new kind of solution could not be found, but it's bad for the existing order. But yeah, a really good challenge. What do I think about AI? That's almost like how much time do you have? How many days do you want to hear me talk? Yes, in some ways, of course, it's unprecedented. But like the invention of like agriculture was unprecedented. It like really changed society. So there have been things, and that we not take it for granted, like it's so easy to like grow. I was just watching this video on Instagram, and some scientist was explaining we can only eat 10% of plants, apparently. Like 90% of plants are completely toxic and dangerous to human beings. So somebody like figured out how to do it. It's like we all, those people, everything about the way we live. And yeah, so there have been scientific advances that really changed society that we've completely come to take for granted, because it's been reconfigured. So in that sense, I think AI too has its precedents, even if it's going to be revolutionary. And I think the question is, it's an open one. We don't know. I've been to a lot of talks. Some people say this is never going to happen, super intelligence, like it's, so it's a big bubble, like, it will, erode institutions, it will damage our institutions greatly, but actually it's not going to live up to its promise. So I see it more as like another feature of the 21st century that's unpredictable. So that's what's interesting to me. It's unpredictable where it will go. So we can't really plan for it. Therefore, the assumptions of the 20th century about politics don't hold. They're not reliable. And the very interesting question about individuals, yes. So like the further back you go in time, it's harder to know how like the individual experiences were, and that makes comparison difficult. At the same time, 16th century, as partly as a result of this connectivity and increase in trade and prosperity, it is a period where we're starting to see the regular people matter more. I mean, we know this from the European setting, but it's also true in other, like across Asia as well. This is a period we associate with like confessionalization, which is a precursor to nationalism. So people in groups and as individuals, they're mattering more. There's kind of a transfer, like that's why we call it early modernity, right? Of the regular people being subjects or slaves to like to people, like the concept of a people, and then the 17th century developments kind of like disrupt that. A lot of people obviously die in this period, and it's a period of suffering in many places, not everywhere. But I think like again, like that individuation or the individuals mattering is later what gives rise to these 18th, like 19th century developments. So I guess maybe that's the good news, right? Like once you have connectivity, once you have order, it does benefit the regular people, and nothing can like, maybe that is a trend that's irreversible. Like you can't completely take that away. I don't know. I mean, I have to think about it. It's a really, really good question. We do have some documentation, but usually it's more like from the elites. But we do know that like more people matter in the 16th century. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answered the question, but really good question. Thank you.
I'm afraid we are basically, out of time. But before I ask you to join me in thanking, Professor Zarakol, something you said about regionalization, struck me as really interesting, and trying to connect it with your first two slides, where you talk about the tumultuous, disorderly 21st century. What I noticed in your slides was that
mostly West
Asia. East Asia was rather absent.
Yes.
Right? And then connecting this point to regionalization, are you suggesting then that despite the disorder that you see, East Asia seems to have been largely exempted? We should be celebrating. Living in East Asia, I don't get that feeling, but I'm curious about your take.
I don't know that anybody has been, exempted, but I do know that this feeling of disorder and crisis is much more acute in the West, partly because the 20th century order is a Western order. So they are feeling the loss of it more. And also, I mean, as a corollary to that, the rest of the world, even in places like Singapore that benefited from 20th century arrangements, there was always a bit more disorder. So there is more, the difference is less, in terms of what you have to navigate. So I think the order is going away for everybody, but the experience of it is slightly different depending on your level of attachment to it.
Thank you. I'm sure you'll agree with me that this has been a really refreshing and original take, on what we can learn from the 17th century, and that can help illuminate the disorderly, times that are coming our way. So please join me in thanking Professor Zarakol for the distinguished. Thank you.